And I remember when I recently went to India. It's not that recent anymore, it's about almost a year ago now. And one of the things that you talk about when you go to India, you talk about the life of the Buddha, because you go to the places where he was 2,500 years ago. And it's natural when you go to those places that you focus on who the Buddha actually was. And what you find out very quickly when you start talking about the Buddha is how little most people actually understand about who the Buddha was, what he actually did. And for that reason, it's actually a very useful way of coming to greater understanding of the Buddha, just by talking about this. And I remember myself, I was also surprised when I started reading in more detail in the Suttas about who the Buddha was. I also had often wrong ideas about who he actually was. But sometimes you have to, it's like you have to go through the discourses of the Buddha with a very fine comb to actually realize who he was and to gain this greater appreciation of this historical figure who lived in India 2,500 years ago. And there are many advantages of talking about the Buddha. Many things, many ways this can actually enhance our practice of Buddhism. It can help us in many ways. And the first one is simply that, as I said before, many people have a very distorted perception of actually who the Buddha was. Very often the stories that we read about the Buddha, they are often not very reliable, unfortunately. Often they are based on late works of the Buddhist tradition, works that happened a long, long time after the Buddha, and they are much more legend and mythology than they actually are history of who the Buddha was. And because of that, it's the legend and mythology, by definition, is something which tends to be inflated. It tends to be changed. It's not really a reliable historical record. A legend or a myth, there can be maybe a core of truth to these kind of myths and legends, but a large part of it is going to be a distortion of what actually happened. So to understand who the Buddha was, we have to go back to the Buddha's own discourses, what he said 2,500 years ago, and only then can we get a reasonable appreciation of what he was and what the Dhamma was all about in relation to his life. And one reason for doing this is that it tends to actually give rise to a lot of trust and confidence and faith in the Buddha's teachings. Because I have found in my own life, I've always had a little bit of historical interest in these matters. And the more I understand of the Buddha, who he was, what he did 2,500 years ago, the closer, in a sense, it comes to me. The closer, the more real he becomes, and the more alive also becomes the Dhamma that he taught. It's almost like you get a relationship with the Buddha when you understand more of what type of personality and why he did the things he did, and why he taught the Dhamma in the way that he actually taught that Dhamma. So it gives, for me at least, and I think it's probably the same for many of you, it gives rise to so much more powerful faith, trust, confidence that this is the right thing. The greater your understanding is, the more powerful these things tend to become. And also, one of the results of this kind of inquiry, I can probably tell you the results straight away because it's very mundane and very ordinary. One of the results of inquiring into the Buddha, who the Buddha was, that you realize that in most ways, in many, many ways, the Buddha was very much an ordinary human being, just like the rest of us. He had his defilements, he had his problems, just like us. And that's precisely because the Buddha was in many ways just like us. That is why his life is so significant for us. That is why we can relate to him as a person. That's why we can use his life as a kind of guiding light in our own practice. That's why we can understand what he was doing, and he could understand us. If the Buddha was some kind of God, if the Buddha was some kind of otherworldly being which has absolutely no relationship to humanity, well then his life is no guide to us anymore, because it becomes something completely separate. There's no relationship between us and the Buddha anymore, because he's something else, he's something other. But if the Buddha is one of us, he's a human being, then suddenly his life becomes tremendously significant, because we can relate to him almost perfectly. And his life can become a guiding principle for also how we can also live our life as Buddhists and practice towards awakening, which obviously was the Buddha's own goal.